Welcome to our panel today, and I'm particularly delighted to introduce today's webinar on the struggle for redress and victim capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the title of the book that Jessie Barton-Hronesova has recently published. I'm Othan Anastasakis, and I'm the director of CISOX, and this is the fourth seminar of our webinar series on the quality of democracy in Southeast Europe, where we are looking at issues of democratic backsliding in the region, including elections, media, separation of power, protests, rule of law. Today, we are discussing Bosnia's victimhood, memory politics, transitional justice, including recognition or non-recognition of crimes, compensation or not, remembrance or oblivion, and all the challenges that a post-conflict society like Bosnia has to confront when it comes face to face with past atrocities and crimes committing against its own people during ethnic wars and conflicts. I have personally known Jessie as her teacher, supervisor, colleague, CISOX associate, friend, and I've admired her deep knowledge on the Balkans and her unwavering dedication on Bosnia's post-conflict recovery. This book is the outcome not only of her intense DPhil years in Oxford, but it's also a long local engagement in Bosnia for a large number of years, a synthesis of her academic as well as her empirical work on the ground, having lived and worked there for quite some time. So I would like to congratulate Jessie on this achievement for writing this excellent account, which I highly recommend, and I believe it's a great contribution to both transitional justice literature, but also the Balkans in general. I will not be presenting and chairing this panel, but I can see that it's an excellent combination of transitional justice, conflict studies, and Balkan experts. And I will be disappearing very soon from this screen, but before I do this, I would like to present our chair of this panel, John Gledhil, our colleague from Oxford. He's an associate professor of global governance in Oxford's Department of International Development and a fellow of St. Cross College. And he has published extensively and investigates diverse themes on peace, conflict, peace building, state formation and dissolution, social mobilization. So this panel is in very safe hands. Before I leave you, I would like to say that we would like, after the presentations, which will be recorded, to put your questions in the question and answer box. And on occasions as well, John will ask you if you want to ask the question yourself so that Julie Adams can unmute you. Julie Adams is behind the CISOX logo, and she is helping us in administering our webinar meeting as usual. The chat function is only for Julie Adams to put information on the book, as well as the CVs of the presenters. And with that, John, over to you. And thank you all for participating in this excellent panel today.
Thank you very much, Othan. Thank you for inviting me to chair this panel, and thanks to Jessie as well for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and indeed an honor to be chairing this celebration of Jessie's book, The Struggle for Redress, which is a study that I've followed on and off really since the outset of the project, in the early days of the project at least, right through its completion as a doctorate, the Department of Politics and IR here at Oxford, and then on to her current position as an ESRC postdoctoral fellow in our department, which is International Development at Oxford. And it's been fascinating to follow the development, the intellectual development of the project, the normative development of the project. And so I'm really delighted that we have the opportunity today to celebrate the book, but also to critically engage with it. And so in that spirit, The structure of the seminar today is going to be an introduction from Jessie to the book itself. And then we have two discussants, Jasna, Dragovic-Soso, and Lord John Alderdice. Let me first introduce each of the speakers, and then I'll sort of remind you of some of the housekeeping rules that Othon has just mapped out. Jessie is currently postdoctoral fellow, ESRC postdoctoral fellow in Oxford's Department of International Development, and, as we know, author of The Struggle for Redress, Victim Capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She has edited and authored several studies on identity politics, including post-war ethno-national identities of young people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 2012, and published a number of articles on retributive transitional justice in journals such as East European Politics, the Journal of Peace Building and Development. Beyond her academic work, Jessie has extensive policy experience. She's previously worked for the ICTY, for the OSCE, and for the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in Sarajevo and Belgrade as well. As often mentioned, she's an associate fellow of CSOCS at Oxford and the Centre for Resolution of Intractable Conflict and of Chatham House's Europe programme. So Jessie will give an introduction to her book for roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll invite Jasna Dragovic-Soso from Goldsmiths, London, to make some contributions in terms of some critiques and engagement with the arguments. Jasna is a professor of international politics and history at Goldsmiths at the University of London, where she works on transitional justice, processes of memory construction of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. She's the author of Saviors of the Nation, Serbia's Intellectual Opposition and the Revival of Nationalism, which came out in 2002, and co-editor of State Collapse in Southeastern Europe, New Perspectives on Yugoslavia's Dissolution. She has many other publications, many other journal articles in leading journals. She also co-edits the Palgrave Macmillan book series on memory, politics, and transitional justice. The second discussant will be Lord John Alderdice, who currently directs the Centre for Resolution of Intractable Conflict, which is based at Paris Manchester College at Oxford University. And he's chair of the Centre for Democracy and Peace Building in Belfast. John is a psychiatrist by profession, and amongst many things he's known for, he was a leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, where he played a significant leading role in the peace talks related to Northern Ireland, which fed into the negotiation for the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Lord Alderdice is first Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and he's held many other international positions, including President of Liberal International. So John will be giving the second set of comments and critiques on the book. But firstly, I'd like to hand over to Jessie to get the ball rolling by introducing us to some of the key themes of the book. So firstly, Jessie, over to you, but also congratulations on this achievement.
Thank you so much. And thank you, CSOCS, for the invitation, as well as thank you very much to the panelists for participating. So the panelists were chosen also because of their support for the book, and as John said, for the engagement that they have really given to this project, be it John as internal examiner, but also as someone that I consulted on the book, Jasna as the editor of the series in which this book was actually published, and John throughout my past year in Oxford as someone that we've extensively worked on a series of events. There are also two other people that I'd like to mention whom my thanks belong. I see one is in the audience, which is Milada Vahudova, who's also been my academic mentor for the past few years and has really supported me on this project. And then Tim Power, together with Othon Anastasakis, who both acted as my supervisors. So there are very many other people that I need to thank to, but that's what the acknowledgement section in the book is for. But I just want to extend my gratitude to all of them, because I think we all need to realize that writing a book is never a singular activity, although it sounds like it. There's always very many people involved in it, notwithstanding the number of respondents that I consulted on this book and the number of interviews and interviewees that I had to consult it. But let me, if I may, let me share my screen with you and present you the main ideas of the book. As a way of as a way of introduction to it and hopefully entice you into reading it. Can you show me if you can see my screen? Perfect, thank you. Right, so the title of the book is The Struggle for Redress, Victim Capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I will talk you through why this is the title, and ultimately you should be walking away from here understanding the main argument and findings of the book. I won't go into the empirical details, but I'm hoping that Jasna will grill me on those a little bit when we get into the discussion. So what is this book actually about, and why did I even decide to study what I'm studying? So this book is ultimately about victims' journey to secure redress in a post-war state. The state that this is about is obviously Bosnia, and I think this is an audience that I don't need to really explain why Bosnia is a particularly interesting case to be studying victims' redress. Not only is it a country that has extremely complicated governance and that has been privy to quite a lot of peace building efforts, but it's also a country that has a very large victim population that still remains in many parts of the country unredressed and unrecognized, and thus gives political scientists the opportunity to study the variety of the different policy outcomes that we're looking at for this population. But fundamentally, beyond my academic interest in transitional justice, this book was also driven by an interest into the role of various actors and how they influence policies of transitional justice and peace building, and in particular victims, because it seemed to me, from, as often said, I spent a lot of time working in the region, and it seemed to me that victims were often sidelined and neglected, or being treated as a bit of a passive actors in transitional justice processes, despite the fact that they were quite vocal. But in terms of the policy approaches, they were being treated as beneficiaries rather than as active participants and shapers of the policy outcomes. So I wanted to have a look at whether this is true, number one. What is it that they demanded? And how have these demands been then translated into policies within the very complex administrative structure of Bosnia? And so the first question I was asking was, how have victims influenced reconstruction in post-conflict states, and Bosnia in particular? What are their aims and how have they gone about achieving them? Through my first initial discussions, I used a very much grounded theory approach when I went into the field and listened, and then realized, what it actually was that I was interested in studying, which was this idea of redress, or legal recognition of a victim status. And this redress or recognition, so recognition being the first part of it, and redress being a set of policies that are both symbolic as well as material, that are being adopted by domestic authorities to provide certain material one-off, monthly, or welfare, in a way, support for victim groups. That was one of the aspects that kept coming out in the interviews repeatedly again, mainly because, as we know, Bosnia has been exposed to quite a lot of the other types of transitional justice, especially the international criminal justice side of it. But this is also the aspect that has been coming out more recently in the more bottom-up literature on transitional justice regarding socioeconomic repair and various types of compensation and reparations. And I have listed some of the books of the authors that have also dealt with this. I see Danielle Lai is also in the audience, so extending my hellos to her too. And what I realized on the ground was that once you started studying what type of redress the victim population in Bosnia has received, it's an extremely haphazard pattern in which different victim groups have been recognized in the country, and then different policies were adopted for them. The International Organization for Migration, when they were trying to do a study on this many years ago, they called it a piecemeal approach to reparations, compensations. Sometimes these were being called one-off payments or welfare payments. There wasn't even an agreement, neither in the policy literature nor in the academic literature, in terms of how do we call these policies. And this is what I call redress. So it can be anything from material benefits to mothers that have lost their husbands on a monthly basis. It can be one-off payments in the type of compensation that we know, but it can also be prioritization in employment or education for children of people that have gone missing, and so on and so on. The list is quite long, actually. So the ultimate question that I'm asking in this book is, why and how has redress been adopted in law in such a complex and piecemeal manner in Bosnia and Herzegovina? How do we explain this variety of redress that I have observed on the ground in Bosnia? And just so that you can visualize this, these are the groups that I studied. And on the right-hand side, you can basically see the varieties. I'm not going to talk in detail about this slide, but suffice to say that I'm basically in the book studying 5 victim groups. And let's maybe talk in the Q&A why I'm looking at these. And the way I'm studying them is through their associations and how they have basically organized themselves, how their activism has panned out in the post-war countries. So from 1995, although some of them organized already during the war, until 2020 approximately, or 2019, when my fieldwork ended. And so I interviewed them, I discussed them, as well as other policymakers and people on the ground, to understand how they went about achieving what they wanted and how this redress has been adopted in law. And I process traced the pathway to addressing, to redressing them, to securing redress, I should say. And so if we look at the outcome, so to speak, you can see that some groups have been recognized at the subnational, so entity level. Some have been recognized at the state level. In some cases, it's only one part of the country or one region of the country that has redressed or that has offered redress, one should say, to the victim groups that I was looking at. I should also say that this process is not over yet. So one of the most recent changes is for victims of torture, who during the time when I was working on this book were not recognized anywhere in the country, but there was a change in 2018. And finally, a new law was adopted. So this process is still ongoing, and in the bigger part of Bosnia and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, they still remain unrecognized, and that has created quite a lot of tension within the community. So the 5 groups I'm looking at are military war victims. We can talk about why I've categorized it this way. A lot of thought went into it. Civilian war victims, families of missing people, victims of torture, also called ex-detainees, and then victims of sexual violence. And the book is structured as a set of mini comparative studies of these different groups, and I'm comparing their outcomes to each other, and I'm explaining how and why they became privy to, or they became subjects and participants in the policy outcomes of redress. Now, the main argument of the book is based on what I call victim capital, which is an idea that crystallized in the past years, and is based on obviously the classical concept of social capital as well. And I define victim capital as the social, political, and economic power of leverage and influence attributed to each of the studied victim groups. And it's got 3 components: moral authority, mobilization resources, and international salience. And the fundamental argument is that victims' redress is mainly the outcome of whether and how victims are able to leverage this victim capital, so these 3 aspects, of either the qualities of their group or the demands that they have, so various types of redress, and how they then subsequently convince domestic political authorities that redress is expedient for them. And that is based more on the conditionality literature and on the IR literature of leverage. And I mean, Milada Vahudova has extensively written on the EU side of it. But this is taking it from a slightly different angle by basically playing with that same idea. However, this argument is very much based on agency of victims. And as I said, we've seen that agency of local actors has really been always sidelined. And what I saw through this research was that it really is, despite all the contextual factors and all the structural constraints of a post-war country such as Bosnia, a lot of the times, and this is my argument, most of the time, it boils down to the agency of victims and their allies, and how they're leveraging the resources, the authority, and the salience they have at a particular time. So it's no longer about only external considerations, which means peace-building impositions of external actors, or ethno-national identities, which is how we've, I think, mainly been perceiving Bosnia. These are the 2 prisms, how we've been looking at Bosnia. Although the latest literature, as I say, has taken a more bottom-up approach. Let me quickly run you through the 3 aspects. So moral authority is pretty much the public recognition that a group has the right to be redressed. So it's this deservingness, and in, for example, criminology, we talk a lot about clean hand victims or ideal victims. Those are usually women and children, and their victim groups are able to leverage frames such as motherhood or womanhood. And then again, there's been quite a lot written in the Bosnian case on this idea before. It also encapsulates identity properties of a group, ethno-national identities, gender identities, social identities, etc. So there we go into the literature of symbolic politics. But fundamentally, the group that would have the highest moral authority is a group that can be considered as a beacon of suffering, and for domestic authorities, a very convenient political actor that can be framed as someone who needs to be taken into consideration and that can be leveraged in elections, for example. And I will talk about the political side of the story at the end. Now, mobilization resources is to do with activism of these groups. Obviously, these concepts are based on academic literature of new social movements, as well as resource mobilization theories. And these are fundamentally the endowments that are controlled by a group. So this might be the type of membership the groups have, the victim associations have, the types of networks, allies, but also financial and information resources. It was quite telling when I was, for example, doing my fieldwork that sometimes you walk into a victim association's office and you don't see a computer, you simply see a notepad and a pen. And then in other cases, you have a fully equipped office with, very good computers, printers, scanners, etc. So already from the observation, you can see that there are huge differences. So the leadership capacities here matter as well. And ultimately then, these groups obviously are better equipped to run campaigns, to potentially destabilize if they want to, which has happened only in the case of military war victims, or protest and show the political authorities that they are a force to be reckoned with. Finally, international salience is very much anchored within the more IR literature, which ultimately is the amount and quality of international attention that's being given to a group and its demands. We can look at the advocacy coalition framework literature. We can look at the various advances in the protection of human rights, new UN conventions. We know that the gender question has come into the foreground in the past 2 decades, luckily. As well as various international court decisions. As I said, Bosnia has been a playground for quite a lot of international criminal justice efforts. So that belongs to this category. Those are obviously also the dominant topics of the date on the humanitarian and human rights agenda, but also the domestic peacebuilding priority. So Bosnia, as I said, has a very strange administrative structure that also includes the role of the High Representative, which at a particular time was able to influence policy directly. Theoretically, that is still possible, but that has not really been happening in the past decade. But this also includes media attention, international media attention, and the very famous CNN effect. So the main findings are that victims that not only have their own victim capital that they can leverage, but when they leverage it at particularly opportune times, like, as we know, these are called in the literature windows of opportunity, such as before elections or when international projects are running, and they can kind of piggyback on some of the traction that a certain issue is carrying. They are more successful at a particular time with their demands that then may translate into redress. The chances are simply higher. Obviously, optimal case scenario would be that you would have a group that has very high victim capital, is high on all of these 3 aspects, or has a very good quality of it. There's only one group that is approximating this in the Bosnian case, which is a subgroup of the missing people families, and those are the Srebrenica organizations and the Srebrenica associations. But still, they still have limited mobilization resources, one could argue. And again, there have been time shifts in how they have played out, both within domestically and especially across the entities and the region, as well as internationally. But the fundamental argument is that the higher the overall victim capital is, the more likely redress becomes. And I call these recipes for redress because I'm not a political scientist that would be looking at causal links. I am mainly trying to explain the different pathways to a certain outcome. And so there are many different pathways to the various types of redress that we have observed in Bosnia. And so this is by no means a deterministic explanation, but it allows us to look at the various aspects that each of the victims groups has, and then acknowledge their activism and their agency in the outcomes. I should also say that obviously, as I said before, context matters. And so different levels of economic development throughout the post-war Bosnian history would matter in terms of whether domestic authorities are even willing to pay anyone out, or are willing to adopt a law that would potentially be very costly. The same with, pluralization or authoritarianization of the country. But these should matter for all victim groups in the same way. And that is the fundamental argument that I'm looking at the intergroup varieties rather than the state as a single unit of analysis. Then I look at the process when domestic authorities then adopt a certain policy, and is it down to because at that particular time, such as the early 2000s, they were more listening, shall we say, to international actors that were, as I said, very strongly involved in domestic politics making, or is it at a time when ethno-national identities, such as currently, are more predominant, so every group is playing more on the ethno-national card, which is what we're observing now. So those were the main empirical findings as well as conceptual findings. But I think what the main book is, what the main message of the book is that this really is, apologies, there's wise politics. This really is a case of post-conflict politics of victimhood. And this is where we observe the various manipulations, the political manipulations that are happening to victims and with victims. But at the same time, we can't romanticize the situation. Some victim groups are more likely to also engage in politics directly and engage in these ethno-national dilemmas and divides and leverage those as well. In the case, for example, of victims of torture, some of the founding members of the key associations were also founding members of the key ethno-political parties in the country. So obviously the ethno-political affiliation played a huge role. However, it's interesting to see the puzzle is that despite the fact that they were this close, victims of torture are the one group that, as I said, until very recently have not been recognized anywhere in the country. So clearly the ethno-national card, does not really work well for the members of those associations. It might work really well for the leaders, but not for the members of these groups. The other aspect of the politics of victimhood that I've observed is the societal polarization, mainly because victims' demands are very much focused on the past. They don't necessarily focus on the future. I think John might be talking about this a little bit because I remember him talking about this from the Northern Ireland context. Because they focus on what is owed to them from the past, there is a bit of a lack in terms of future direction of the country and reconciliation. We don't like the term reconciliation in the Balkans, but this idea of coming together, it's very much about, who harmed us and what we are owed. And that is also linked to the fact that when we talk about a lower middle income country like Bosnia, resources are scarce. And so, groups are competing for a smaller pot of socioeconomic support that they can reasonably reach or attain from the state. But beyond these material competitions, we also see the symbolic competitions at the level of identities and this very famous competition of victimhood, who is a bigger victim than others and why have those been recognized whilst we haven't. The one thing that I must mention is that this book is mainly about the process of adoption. So how do we get to the fact that we have a law adopted? So the Families of Missing People scored an amazing success in the Bosnian case in 2004 with a state level law for the missing people, which is quite unprecedented, not only in Bosnia, but worldwide at that time, certainly. Some aspects of it have been implemented. The aspects that would support the individual victims remain unimplemented, such as a victims fund. So despite the fact that there was this huge success in terms of adoption, the implementation has really been lagging behind. And that is the case for most of these legal adoptions, with some exceptions. And I will leave it there and I'll look forward to both your questions as well as the panelists' comments.
Thank you so much, Jessie. The fantastic overview of, again, what is an outstanding study. This is a study that is obviously deeply embedded in Bosnian politics and the post-conflict experience of Bosnia, but also a study that has generalizable implications, thinking about the cases I'm more familiar with from various corners of the globe that have gone through post-conflict peace-building processes. And in that spirit, the two discussants that we have will be focusing respectively on the Bosnian context, Balkan context, and then the wider context in the case of John. So just so the audience sort of knows where we're going in terms of the structure of the discussion to follow, I'm going to invite Jasna and John to offer some comments in turn. Jessie will then respond to their comments immediately, and after that we'll open it up to the Q&A. And at that point I'll remind everybody of some of the the rules for sort of posting questions and things that Othon mapped out at the beginning. But for the moment, I'd like to hand over to Jasna Dragovic-Soso to offer her immediate feedback on Jessie's presentation and book. Jasna.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to Othon and to Jessie for inviting me to be part of this panel. I am really pleased to be here. I'm just sorry we're not in person, and I hope you can see the book in my screen right now. There is also a flyer, I hope, that the publishers have provided kindly with a discount to the book, which should be posted in the chat. And I would just like to say that as one of the series editors, I was very pleased, indeed all three of us were, to have Jessie's book in our series, which is on memory politics and transitional justice. And I really would like to reiterate that we feel very strongly that although this is a very in-depth, rich and detailed account of the Bosnian case, both ourselves and also the reviewers for the series thought that the broader implications of this study in other kinds of post-conflict settings, or even in cases, for example, following natural disaster situations or relating to refugees or forced migrants, could benefit from some of the theoretical and empirical conclusions of the study. Now, Jessie has asked me to present mainly how the book relates to the transitional justice literature on the post-Yugoslav region. So I will be focusing my brief comments around that. I will highlight what I think the main contributions are. And then I will finish off with a couple of questions, which Jessie has also partially already alluded to or answered to some degree in her presentation. So as I'm sure you all know, the post-Yugoslav space has really represented a veritable sort of laboratory of transitional justice, as Eric Gordy and I argued some 10 years ago. And there has also been a vast amount of scholarship on the subject. Now, I would briefly just schematically say that a first wave of the scholarship was focused very much on the International Criminal Tribunal, the ICTY in The Hague, both in terms of its contributions to the development of human rights and international law, and also, of course, in terms of its impact on the ground. And we've had some very good studies of the impact on the ground. And I think it would be fair to say that until now, this scholarship still remains the most extensive focus of transitional justice studies in the region. However, in the last decade or so, there has been a growing emphasis on transitional justice processes at the ground level, with more studies that have been devoted to civil society projects, to non-judicial forms of justice and peace building, and also, of course, to grassroots activism and memory activism. And this work has been informed by extensive field work and participant observation of processes at the ground level. And Jessie's book fits squarely into this second wave of work. And I would say that its contribution lies first and foremost in what I would call, and what she refers to, I think, as the politics of victimhood. And as she herself notes, I think, in her introduction and in her brief presentation just now, her approach departs from the earlier tendency to frame the discussions of Bosnian war victims and victimhood more generally in relation to trauma and questions of retributive justice, for example, the role of victim witnesses in international and domestic judicial proceedings. And instead, she focuses on what she calls victim capital. In other words, the ability of victims through their associations and their social mobilization to influence policy and to achieve material compensation and changes in the law and in policy. In other words, here what we see are victims who are not just simple recipients of justice, but actually agents of processes of redress. And I think this is a really, really important contribution. As other scholars have also touched upon, I'm thinking here, for example, of Lisa Helms, or the French scholars Isabelle Delplat or Cécile Jouanneau, who have adopted a similar approach to victimhood. And I think this is where I would situate Jessie's book in the first instance, as an original contribution to this literature. And I think her contribution is twofold. And in particular, this comes out of its, I would say, unprecedented breadth and comprehensiveness. First of all, as she mentioned in her brief overview, she discusses a range of organizations that relate to different forms of victimhood. She looks at both civilian and military victims. She looks at victims of sexual violence, of torture, of families of missing people, and so on. So basically, it's probably the most comprehensive, I would say, overview of the different types of victims that we have seen in the Bosnian conflict. And secondly, she examines the various levels at which this victim capital, as she calls it, is accrued. So it ranges all the way from the international down to the sort of domestic, political, and social sphere, through what she calls domestic moral authority, and then finally also at the grassroots level, which she refers to as mobilization resources. And she examines each one of her cases in relation to each of these levels, carefully evaluating how they interacted with each other over time. And then in addition to that, she presents, as she mentioned, comparative analysis of the different groups, analyzing, why somebody's leg is worth more than somebody else's, depending on what kind of victim they were or they represented. So that would be the first sort of important point. The second important point is that Jessie's book also resonates with broader trends in transitional justice research, which have now turned towards questions of socioeconomic justice and questions of material redress. And this is also starting to make it felt in the post-Yugoslav region, and the literature and the scholarship on the post-Yugoslav region. And I think Jessie also mentioned, and Daniela is in the audience, Daniela Lai's recent book also deals with this aspect and is a most welcome addition to the literature. So Jessie's book, I think, fits squarely in this trend and is groundbreaking in its careful analysis of the politics and the political economy of compensation, providing, as I said, an incredibly comprehensive discussion of the emergent legal framework and also the details of the various forms of financial compensation that are achieved by different victim groups. And this really in-depth and meticulous research, I think, adds greatly to our overall understanding of what is still an under-researched area of transitional justice, at least in the region. So in the last couple of minutes, I would just like to finish by asking Jessie to comment on two related points. And the first point relates to what Jessie calls the optimal scenario. In other words, the scenario where all three levels, international salience, domestic moral authority, and mobilization resources align and produce what can be seen, or what she calls success in terms of redress. And this is the case, as she mentioned, for example, of the missing persons associations, which largely draw on the impact of the Srebrenica family and women's organizations, who managed to achieve the unique result of getting legal change at the Bosnian state level in 2004. In other words, not just at the level of the entities. And I think what the book shows very nicely is that even in this optimal scenario, the success was actually short-lived. In other words, after the passing of the unprecedented legislation at state level, little actual material benefit accrued to the victims as a whole, with the exception, of course, as she mentioned, of some of the leaders of this group who benefited quite substantially. So my question is then, even if the optimal scenario results in this kind of outcome, then what does that tell us about the overall power of victim capital? It seems to be at best partial and certainly short-lived. So I would like her to comment perhaps on the potential of redress in the long term, whether these kinds of successes can be seen as evolving over time into something more positive in the long term. So kind of let's look towards the future now. Where can it go from here? And my second question also relates to the first. And I would invite Jessie to consider one aspect of the politics of victimhood that she discusses in the book, but that is perhaps a little bit different from this frame of domestic political authority as she defines it. And this relates to the role of victims as essentially the protagonists of a usable past for the national and even the nationalist narratives of victimhood that are articulated by the leading political parties. And I suppose my question is, might this actually represent a related but separate element of victim capital, and one that perhaps plays a really key role in the eventual success or failure of the demands that are articulated by the victim groups that are considered? And I will just stop here. I think I've kept to my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jasna. Passing straight over to John Alderdice for his contribution. John.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and thank you very much, Jessie and colleagues, for the very kind invitation to participate in this event. Hearty congratulations to Jessie for all the work that she did and that she put into this excellent and I think rather important book, and I'll say a little later why I think it's so important. I also feel a little bit moved at this particular time because later this month, I will be celebrating with colleagues from Bosnia what would have been the 80th birthday of Paddy Ashdown, who was High Representative. On Saturday, the 27th of February, he would have been 80 years old. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But some folk from Bosnia got in touch with some of my colleagues and said, we really want to remember the efforts that he as an outsider made to deal with some of our problems. And of course, he was an outsider in the sense of coming from outside of the region, but he was also someone who came from Ireland, a place which had had a different conflict, but nevertheless one which, as Jessie and others have remarked, also left many victims. I guess one of the things I'd like to start off by remarking is that this kind of work is very different from most political research work because of the emotional significance of the material that's being addressed. I remember many years ago, we didn't have much in the way of organised bereavement counselling in Northern Ireland. And I got together with some friends to try to develop a local branch of CRUIS, the organisation that is for the widows and bereaved. And we were working with Queen's University, and the extramural department were going to run the training course for the therapists or counsellors. And the person who was running it said, well, now we'll start off with so many people, which is about 3 times more than we want to come out at the other end, because I know from my experience that about 3 times as many people start extracurricular courses than ever finish up with them. And the person who was coming with the experience of who said, no, you're wrong. Almost all of them will stick through with this. He said, look, I've organized these conferences and trainings for years. I said, no, but you haven't organized them for people who've been through bereavement. There's a completely different dynamic. And I just want to flag up for others who are watching and who have been doing research work themselves and political science and in lots and lots of other areas. You need to be aware that when you're working with these kinds of experiences, material and people, there is an emotional significance and a very troubling significance to the engagement that you have. You do not come away unchanged, one might even say unscathed, by working with people who have been through these kinds of problems. And that's an unusual experience for academics. It's sometimes a very disruptive one, but I just wanted to flag it up. It's very important indeed. The second thing I wanted to say is that in the book, Jessie tries to deal with the complexity of the problems that she's facing and addressing. And that's really very commendable. It's not at all easy, but it's very important. There can be a tendency to try to simplify things, to try to see, for example, all victims through the same lens. She absolutely doesn't do that at all. Tries to tease out the different kinds of victims. And of course, one of the big questions that arises in these circumstances is, who is a victim? It's easy to say, let's pay attention to victims. But there are all sorts of different kinds of victims. And of course, one of the great struggles that is around is between those who are regarded as innocent victims, quotes, and those who are not regarded by others as being innocent victims. And there's a different quality to how they are treated, how they are regarded both domestically and in the international community. And of course, in a divided society, there are some people who may be regarded as victims by one section of the community, but regarded as not victims at all, but on the contrary, as part of the problem and as part of the assault on their situation. So victimhood is a very difficult problem, a very challenging one. And when Jessie talks about recognition and redress, of course, recognition is very much only the first step in the whole process of what people are trying to achieve with this issue of victimhood. But she tries to look at this in a comprehensive way, and I think that's much to be commended. Jasna was saying that this is an important book, not just because it's relevant to the region itself, but it's relevant to other regions and other conflicts. And I think that's absolutely right. And I don't think it's unfair to broaden it out further than that, because, for example, I found myself in dealing with intractable conflict, not just dealing with the kind of conflict in the Balkans, which has come and gone over hundreds and hundreds of years, like it's been the case in Ireland, but other kinds of conflicts which don't break out in the same way. For example, the intractable conflict between First Nation people and those who now live in that territory, working, for example, with people, Aboriginal people, First Nation people in various parts of Latin America. And that's very different because these are people who feel so powerless, and indeed are so powerless in some ways, that they're unable to engage in a violent conflict. But they feel victims, and they are victims. And when, for example, the Australian government has tried to deal with the problem of Aboriginal people and say, well, those people are victims and we need to try to help them, the more they've tried to work at it and the more resource they put into it, the worse has become the situation of those people. It's a quite paradoxical kind of business, and trying to tease that out, to dig into it, to try to understand it is really very important. I think Jessie tries to do that in this situation. And I would just like to say that effort, that work to try to understand what victimhood consists of is really important. It's very important in understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and the sense there of victimhood and how do you address that. She talks about the agency of victims, and this is a very important thing. There are some victims who feel they have no agency at all. There's nothing I can do. It's all just terrible and hopeless and dreadful. Other people need to come and sort this problem out in some kind of way. And I find that in many situations of conflict. You go along and the people sit down and they tell you what the rest of the world has to do to solve their problem. And what you know very well is that the rest of the world will never solve their problem. And then there are other victims, and they do find a way of developing agency, and they become very active, and they may actually become politically very active and become part of an attempt to refight a war in a different kind of way. And they may become quite powerful in that. But But herein is a problem, because it then becomes very difficult for them to move away from being victims. Because in a sense, they need to sustain that sense of being a victim in order to give themselves the power to prosecute the particular campaign in which they are engaged with perhaps a political entity. And that leads me to the question of what it is that victims actually want. And in a sense, this was referred to by both Jessie and Jasna, because the question is, what would make it all better? What would make them not feel victims any longer? Would it be the question of recognition? Well, that's a first important step. But what would redress look like? In many ways, of course, what a victim wants is to return things to the way they were beforehand. And that can't be done. It's not possible. Would some kind of socioeconomic recompense help? Well, sometimes it can help a little bit, but sometimes it's seen as an absolute insult. That's the amount of money that you're putting on my suffering, whatever that is, personal, physical suffering, mental suffering, the loss of a member of my family. And sometimes that can make people even more angry than they were when there wasn't any recognition at all. It's a very difficult business, this question of what is it that victims actually want. And victims are not our group. They're a whole heterogeneous mix of people who will have very different experience. There are some who take up the business of being a victim and become people who are forgiving in a very genuine way, and they move to a quite different place. And they're sometimes attacked by those who don't feel in a position to respond in that kind of way. They're regarded as having betrayed those who have suffered. And others, particularly from outside, will often look at them as very commendable figures for what they've done. So there's a problem of what you do about all of this. And there are two or three problems I'd refer to. One is the problem of making things into memories. A memory is something of the past. And one of the problems is that the capacity to make things into memories, to make them be of the past and not to be of your current experience, is one of the great challenges. As we develop the capacity to make things into a memory, individually, or to make them into history as a community. But what happens for many victims is these are not memories, they are their continuing experience. That's what happens in post-traumatic stress disorder. And to give that up and allow things to be the past, it means giving certain things up. And that can be a very difficult thing. The problem of what can be achieved and not be achieved by the law, and Jessie was mentioning the question of law and what can be achieved by a law. One of the interesting things about Colombia is right at the start of their peace process, they passed a victim law. In Northern Ireland, the victims were the last people we tried to deal with. Neither of these have been frightfully successful, I may say, but I think the Colombian example is a better one. At least they thought about the victim at an early stage. How far it's possible to do any kind of therapy, either for individual victims or for the community that has been damaged, is another important question. And how far socioeconomic issues can address questions which are not fundamentally socioeconomic. They're questions of feelings and disturbed historic relationships. I just think that Jessie has opened these things up. She hasn't gone for a simplistic analysis. She's tried to address the complexity of the situation. And I think this is a tremendous contribution that I hope will encourage other people, as well as she herself, to continue to explore and deepen our understanding of these issues. Not because there is some kind of solution, not a simple solution, but a solution to these problems. They are problems of human relationships, and human relationships are not resolved. They are something we have to continue to work at. Thank you very much indeed, Jessie, for this enormous contribution, not just to the literature, but to the challenge that people in conflict situations are continually trying to address.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Jasna, as well. I'm now going to invite Jessie to respond directly to some of the comments from Jasna and John. And after that, we'll hand it over to Q&A discussion with everybody. And just in terms of timing, we have until around about 6:30, so we're going to have a good amount of time for Q&A from the audience. But firstly, over to Jessie.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Jasna and John, for the comments. Let me start with Jasna. So Jasna, you are absolutely right that the power of victim capital is limited. And I should have said upright that this book is, when I talk about success, I'm mainly focusing on the first step in this process of redress, which is the step of being recognized and having redressed in law. The implementation of it, this is where the victim capital is extremely limited, and this is where we get into, as you mentioned later, in distributive politics, and this is where we get into the ethno-national aspects of it. What victim capital in my book is mainly representing is the first step in the policy adoption process, so to speak. The policy implementation is then down to a series of other constraints, and a lot of the times it boils down to local politics, and as you said rightly, it boils down to allegiances with various political actors, but it also boils down to some practical details about how in such a complex country such as Bosnia, certain laws can be and cannot be implemented. As we know, it's a country that has 147 ministries, and things basically get stuck. Despite the fact that they have been adopted in law, they get stuck in the process by someone not signing the right document, passing it on, or someone simply obstructing the process for political reasons. I still do see that there is a future, because in a different context, where obstructionism is not as prominent as in the context of Bosnia, the concept of victim capital is meant to explain the differences between the groups. So none of the aspects of victim capital, the way I'm describing them in the book, are in a way discrete. They are all, number one, related, but they're also not uniform. They're not stable. They're changing. They're fluid. But at the same time, I'm comparing them to the other groups. So in comparison to the other groups, is the situation of the missing persons better? In many respects, it is. When we look at the other victims group, in particular, the various subgroups. Overall, has that much been achieved in this respect? Not really. When we look at the implementation, but Bosnia is notoriously one of those countries that has adopted a lot of laws initially, and not that many of them have been successfully implemented. So one might say that this is a shortfall of the book, but I felt that to do justice to the very difficult process of negotiating these policies, I had to first focus on the first step, and then potentially in the second book focus on the next step, which is very much about yes, this other aspect of politics of victimhood, and how usable pasts that the victims represent is being used in the daily politics of the country. And it is certainly the case. And as you mentioned, it's more true for some victims than it is for others. And I think John also mentioned that some victims simply don't want to have anything to do with this politics. They don't want to do anything with these associations. They don't want to do anything with redress. However, and now moving on to John's comments, why socioeconomic justice important? I think obviously it's all contextualized. It is more important in countries that are poorer, because it allows people obviously not to heal. It doesn't allow them to move on, but it does allow them at least to function, to access, for example, mental health. You were talking about some of the programs which were really scarce in the case of Bosnia, and PTSD has not really been ever properly treated. It allows life to continue to a certain level, however we want to call it. And after, I remember, and I'm quoting it in the book as well, and after all those, transitional justice processes that the country has been exposed to, and as Jasna said, being a bit of a laboratory, especially of criminal prosecution, people want some tangibility from transitional justice. And as one of my respondents said, what do I care that someone, I mean, they do obviously care, but I don't have any tangible results from someone like Radovan Karadzic getting a life sentence. I still don't have food on my table, and I'm still struggling, and I need medical health, and I have to pay medical bills, and I can't because I haven't been recognized. My status has not been recognized. So I have to pay when I go to the hospital. And things like that then become to matter on a daily basis. And I think especially in a context where, the war has been over for 25 years, but we're still living in it in a different way. And I think you mentioned that as well, that war is basically being fought through different means. And I think victims a lot of the times are being used as usable parts and as usable weapons, and they're basically being weaponized for political reasons. But as we mentioned, some of them are willing participants, other ones are unwilling participants, other ones basically want to stay clear of anything. So it really depends, and the micro level of the politics of victimhood is extremely complex, and it's even more complex than what I was able to present in the book.